So anybody else have 3 o'clock? I think it's 3 o'clock. Are we supposed to start at 3? Yes? Okay, please do. I'll be much more relaxed in about an hour and a half. Afternoon, everybody. Is this on? How about now? That sounds better. Afternoon, everybody. Thank you for your support of the conference. Thank you for coming to this workshop. Human beings exist because of ruminants. Today's societies rely upon them worldwide, and humanity's future depends upon improvements in the productivity and efficiency of worldwide ruminant animal agriculture. I make the case elsewhere that humanity needs a ruminant revolution, analogous to the Green Revolution, to develop and deploy the knowledge and technology necessary to meet the mid-21st century demand for ruminant animal products while preserving and enhancing the environments in which they're produced. We need a revolution in our thinking of what constitutes a healthy diet, of what causes chronic illness, of the vital role that animals play in the human diet, and the essential nature of ruminant animal agriculture in meeting humanity's needs. This will mean overthrowing established policies and institutions and confronting vested belief systems. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Ms. Amber O'Hearn and Dr. Sara Place. I'm grateful for their participation in this workshop. First to speak will be Amber O'Hearn. Amber is a data scientist by profession with a background in math, computer, and cognitive sciences. Her current focus is the nutritional implications of animal-sourced foods and their role in evolution and brain development. The title of her presentation is The Ruminant Legacy for Human Nutrition. Please welcome my friend and colleague, Amber O'Hearn. Screen icon. This one? Yeah. Does that not? Oh, it's on. Never mind.
Okay, but sorry, this doesn't look how I expect quite yet. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And thank you so much for coming. It is a great honor to be here. I have spoken often at conferences for audiences who are dietitians or clinicians medically, but I've never yet had the privilege to speak to people who are actually involved in the production of meat, which is such a critical resource and so undervalued in our society. So thank you very much for that. All right. So, let me just, it's working. It's just that I cannot see these notes.
Oh. It is, but it's converted.
I don't think that's the problem. It's just not in
the present mode, but it is. Okay, so is there a...
Oh, click that one. This one?
This one?
No, this one. This one.
That's...
All right.
Okay. Okay, sorry.
This is pretty good. Thank you for your patience. So, as you well know, what happens to an animal when you feed it the food that is not the correct food for that animal things go wrong, right? Every species has a unique nutritional need based on its physiology, and if you're consistently feeding an animal the wrong food, it takes a toll. The further that the diet is from the animal's natural diet and the longer that they're on that diet, the worse the outcome is. Trying to... Diabetes in humans is a growing global problem, and it's one example of a disease in humans that comes from feeding the wrong food to the kind of animal that we are. Some people actually insist that the offending element in our diets is saturated fat and animal protein. Saturated fat's only found in meat. Depending on the day, I find this assertion somewhere to be in the vicinity of perplexing, ridiculous, or outrageous. Because, in fact, oh, you're not seeing what I'm seeing. I have paged down.
Oh, and yeah, it's not showing what you're seeing, yes? Mm-hmm. Okay, try closing it.
Start again?
Yeah, the Microsoft, don't save. And then reopen the Microsoft fix here. See if that fixes it.
I'm actually a computer scientist by trade.
You didn't have to tell them that. Now just hit that.
This one?
Yay!
All right. All right, so here's what I was seeing when I was talking about diabetes being this global epidemic. And here's what I wanted you to see when I was saying that people are insisting that this is the food that's causing us a problem. But of all of the foods that we eat today, meat is the one that humans are actually best adapted for according to our physiological needs and our history as a species, especially meat with lots of fat in and on it. And not only that, but many of the plant foods that we eat actually interfere with our nutrition, especially if we eat them in large quantities. We are great apes, and that fellow on the left is one of our closest relatives, but obviously we're very, very different animals. Humans and gorillas are even more different from each other than, say, sheep and goats. Besides the whole hair issue, we're obviously drastically different in the capacity of our brains, and we're also drastically different in our guts and our digestive physiology. Both of these are incredibly important determiners of our food requirements. I think it's helpful to go back and think about what the basic functions of food are. We have three different basic functions. We need food for energy, and not just deliberate energy like for motion or thinking, but for every process that's going on in our bodies all the time. We need food for our structure to build our bodies from, and we need food for micronutrients, which are really just chemical ingredients in all the reactions that are happening throughout our bodies all the time. Animals, of course, are made primarily out of protein and fat. That's why they're so delicious. Every tissue, whether it's a stationary tissue like your muscles or your bones or your nerves or your skin, or whether it's mobile like your hormones or your immune cells or your blood cells, is made primarily of protein with some fat. We can make all the proteins that we need out of amino acids as long as we have access to these 9 of them, although there are some that we do better if we get direct sources of them rather than having to make them all ourselves. Fat is so important that we can make it out of almost anything, but there are two kinds of fats that we can't make on our own, the omega-3 and the omega-6 fatty acids. Energy, of course, is acutely important from moment to moment. We need it constantly to stay alive. And we can get it from many sources. Technically, any chemical that we have the ability to break down is a source of energy because we just get energy from breaking a chemical bond. When it's broken, it releases energy, and our cells can do that from a variety of sources that are carbohydrates or protein or fat. But just because we can do it from different sources doesn't mean that they're equally good sources. If you look at a food label, and I'm not sure what this monstrosity is, it will include calories from protein. But this is really a mistake. Because remember, most of your body is made out of protein. And when you eat protein, the primary use of that protein is for structure. So you have to eat a certain amount of protein a day to maintain the structure of your body. And so if you're counting the protein that you're taking in from food as calories, you're actually overcounting the calories that you're getting. Whenever you eat protein, some portion of it gets incorporated into your body, and some portion gets broken down into sugars and into other breakdown products like ammonia. The more that you eat, the more proportion will actually get broken down, but it never goes all the way to zero. And it's rarely even most of it. So it's very misleading to count protein as calories. Most of it will never be used for energy, and in fact, you can only get so much energy from protein without becoming sick. In historical times, where only lean meat was available, this sickness has sometimes been referred to as rabbit starvation. It doesn't happen with fatty meat because fatty meat has fat, which you can use for energy. Fat is actually the ideal and primary source of energy for all mammals. It's efficient, and it's actually clean in the biochemical sense that it creates less oxidative stress and damage when you use fat for energy instead of carbohydrates. Now, even herbivores who don't ingest much fat are, of course, still primarily getting most of their energy from fat, because what they do, of course, is they get it out of fiber. Ruminants do it in the rumen, and other herbivores, like our gorilla friend, do it mostly in the colon and another organ in the digestive tract called the cecum, which comes after the stomach. But in both cases, we have microbes that are acting like little princesses who are spinning this straw of fiber into gold, the fat, which is what we really want, what our cells really want. But humans can't really do that the way that the gorilla could. Compared to our great ape and other primate cousins, we just don't have the guts. This graph is showing the relative size, the volume that's dedicated to the different parts of our digestive tract. And you can see that compared to those primates, we have only about a third of the colon. We have almost no cecum to speak of. And although we still have the ability to ferment some fiber, we're maxed out at about 100 calories, which really isn't enough at all. Well, what about carbohydrates? That is what most of us, most people on the planet are using for energy right now. So obviously, we can do that. There's no doubt about it. But if the question is whether this is the energy source that humans are best adapted for, then the answer is no. First of all, almost none of the foods that you see on this page, except for the honey, even existed for most of the history of humankind. Humans have been around, well, Homo species, different varieties, have been around for a couple of million years, and humans for a couple of 100,000 years. Plant domestication is only about 10,000 years old. The grains and the fruits and the roots depicted here are all modern inventions. So the plant that now yields this voluptuous-looking grain used to look like the picture on the left. And the high-sugar banana doesn't even grow naturally even now. Every banana that you see in the store is a grafted clone of one result that's been repeated. Its natural predecessors used to be seedy and fibrous. This is true of almost all the fruit that we eat here today, including oranges and apples. They're grafts, and if you grow them from seed, they pretty much immediately revert to the fibrous, inedible varieties. As an aside, if you were to feed monkeys, who are stereotypically, they eat bananas. If you do that in a zoo, they will get diabetes because they don't benefit from a high sugar diet any more than a cattle do. And even though we aren't herbivores of any sort, we don't benefit from getting most of our calories as sugar either. These roots that you probably recognize on the right in the form there, that form has only been around for a few hundred years, actually, and their predecessors were little better than twigs. Imagine the desperate times that we must have been experiencing to bother with any of these foods. All the foods that we eat now that provide energy in the form of carbohydrates are derived from plants that were mostly fiber in the past. We lost our ability to ferment this fiber as a primary source of calories, and so this simply wasn't a plausible source of energy for us, and there has to have been an alternative. The other problem, as an aside, with eating plants is they can't run away, and so they've developed other strategies for dealing with predators. Some of these strategies involve actual toxins, but the vast majority of plants on the planet are simply inedible for humans, largely because of toxicity. And all the ones that we eat today, even though it seems like a large variety, they've all been bred from a few varieties that we found that were edible enough to eat, and we've selectively bred out the toxicity down to tolerable levels. But there are other compounds in many of the plants that we regularly eat that disrupt our ability to absorb nutrients to some degree. For example, the oxalates that are in green leafy vegetables and the lectins and the phytates that are in grains and legumes actively inhibit the absorption of minerals that cause us to need to take in a lot more to get our needs met. And this means that some of the food sources that we eat are actually subtractive in their value. So even if they're providing calories, there's a trade-off that we need to be aware of. So micronutrients are the last but not least of the functions of the food that we need. They're used in all of our systems. They're used to facilitate chemical reactions in processes like digestion, and the creation of energy, and the functioning of our immune system, and growth and vision. So I'm going to focus again on our unique human needs since we're talking about a very specific species. Unlike any other animal that we know, human brains continue to grow for over a decade. And critically, this intensive growth lasts long past weaning. So that means we can't rely simply on what's available in breast milk in order to get our needs met. We have to make sure that we're getting all our nutrients long past weaning. Moreover, there are critical stages to brain growth. And if you don't get all of the nutrients that you need during certain stages of growth, you can't necessarily make it up later. And you may have to deal with the consequences of those deficits into your adulthood. So what are those critical nutrients that brains need? Well, besides protein and fat and energy, there are specific structural elements and micronutrients that brains cannot develop properly without. Many of them are so important that if you don't get them as an infant or as a growing child, then you could suffer permanent deficits, from mild cognitive and social emotional kinds of problems to frank blindness and even mental retardation. The most important minerals for the brain are iron, iodine, zinc, and selenium. And it turns out that the best sources of those are animal sourced. And it also turns out that a diet heavy in grains and legumes reduces their availability. Similarly, the most important vitamins for brain growth include vitamin A and D and multiple B vitamins. And in some cases, our conversion of these vitamins from plant sources are too low to make them really feasible. And in some cases, excess plant intake, again, can interfere with their absorption. I wanted to mention some bioactive compounds that I've listed here, which are complex proteins Again, they are things that we can make in our bodies from amino acids if we have those available, but there is evidence that if we get them directly, that can actually benefit us. And some of those, like choline and creatine and taurine, only exist in meat. And so it can be of benefit to eat meat even if you're already getting those amino acids from other sources. Finally, these fatty acids, DHA and arachidonic acid, are really important for brain growth. This graph is from a paper that is arguing for adding arachidonic acid to formula because it's been shown that if an infant isn't getting breast milk, the amount of arachidonic acid in their blood won't match the amount that they would have if they were actually breastfeeding. The arachidonic acid is an omega-6 fatty acid, and DHA is an omega-3 fatty acids. Our brain is made of fat and cholesterol, and these fatty acids actually make up the phospholipids. The graph is showing how much those phospholipids are being incorporated into the brain as it grows as a child. And you can see it starts to level off, but even after it begins to level off, we know that there's more brain growth coming, and we also know that you need to have more of these fatty acids available even as an adult to maintain your optimal brain use. So what was available for most of our history as a species? Between the time that our ancestors passed from this herbivorous stage of the Australopithecines to the various Homo species, Africa changed from mostly wetlands to mostly grasslands, and that opened a niche for grazing animals. Here are the kinds of foods that would have been available at the time, although not necessarily equally available, not necessarily equally nutritious. Ruminants, of course, were there, but they were much bigger. There were much bigger grazing animals at that time than there are now. And the bigger a mammal is, the more fat it has on its body, so that needs to be observed as well. There was some freshwater fish, but that didn't necessarily happen until later in this time period. We had access to tubers, roots, but like we've already seen, many of them were mostly fiber and not, you don't want to be picturing here a potato or a yam, because that's just not the reality of what was there. There were some nuts, they were seasonal, and there were some other wild plants. So now, and I did want to just put a finer point on it by showing a picture of a modern hunter-gatherer tribe. This is a Hadza man who is cooking some tubers of the type that might have been available over a fire. So there's not a lot of starch available there. Of the starch that is available, you can maybe get about a quarter of it out through cooking. Cooking wasn't even widely available through most of the period of our species history. And so the Hadza reportedly eat this tuber, but they consider it their least preferred food for obvious reasons. So now we get to play this game, right? We have these foods available. How are we going to possibly get all the things that we need by mixing and matching what were available? So you can get a little bit of things that you need from tubers. It's definitely better than nothing, moderately. You can get better results with nuts. They have a moderate amount of energy. They have some protein. In some cases, they actually have some very good sources of minerals. But on the other hand, they're really high in phytates, which can very much inhibit the absorption of minerals. So it might be actually a wash in certain cases. Other plants can be used as a good source of vitamins, but again, it's a trade-off because they very often also have these interfering compounds. And they're not going to do much for your caloric intake. You're still going to be hungry after. Freshwater fish, once it became available, is now a much, much better source of almost everything except calories. And an argument could be made that if you used that and you combined it with nuts, you could get everything that you needed. But if you look at ruminants, once you have that, it's a one-stop shop. You can get all the energy that you need from fat, subcutaneous fat. You can get those essential fatty acids that we need for brain growth by eating their brains. You can get the protein that you need from mussels. You can get all the minerals without any of that disruption. And you can even get all the vitamins that you need, believe it or not, from meat. So once you have ruminants in the picture, you actually don't need anything else. And if you don't have ruminants in the picture, you're in a very poor position. So I want you to just let that sink in for a moment. The diet that was available to us for most of our existence had to have been high in animal protein and high in animal fat and relatively low in energy from carbohydrate from all combined sources. This is the kind of species that we are. This is the diet that we are optimized for and that meets most of our nutritional needs with grazing animals. But of course, we're in a completely different food situation now. So what happened and how did we get here? The major event that, or it was not just one event, but the major thing that happened that caused our environment to change was the extinction of most of the large mammals on the planet. So this chart just shows that 125,000 years ago, the average weight of a mammal species was basically bovine size. That's average. So if you're thinking about all the small little animals that are running around, for each of those, there's a compensation of even larger animals than bovine to balance out, to make them the average. And now, the average weight of a mammal species is about 25 pounds. So the consequences of this were that the game that we were getting were much, much less fat, which means less energy available, right? There's less game available in general. So we were gradually relying more and more on plants, culminating in this domestication of starches, which was really very important with grain agriculture about 10,000 years ago. Now, this had advantages, obviously, as well as disadvantages. So cultivating grains gave us a new source of energy from starch, which was able to replace the fats that were going missing. And this allowed us to meet at least our energetic needs for a lot more people. But at the same time, we're more prone to famine, because if you're relying on crops, then all it takes is one disease or one pest event, and you could lose your entire food source for the year. But it also came with a higher risk of malnutrition, because you weren't getting as much meat, and you were eating more and more of these types of plants that bring inhibition of minerals and other vitamins to the table. So I'm going to show you a bit of data that I got from this document by the World Health Organization and the FAO, talking about using fortification to meet the needs of the global micronutrient deficiency problem. So we're in a situation now where about half of the people in the world are suffering from anemia. Now, there are other causes of anemia besides iron deficiency, but about half of the cases are simply from a deficiency of iron. Your body carries oxygen to the brain in the blood through hemoglobin, which is made of iron. And so if you don't have enough iron, you literally can't get enough oxygen to all your tissues, which is going to affect your thinking. It's going to affect your physical performance. If you don't get enough, you're going to be weak, and you're just going to be more likely to die, especially if you are a woman, a mother, or a child. This is what that document says about, this is how they characterize a diet that would be low in available iron. They say it would be a simple, monotonous diet based on cereals, roots, or tubers with negligible amounts of meat, fish, poultry, or ascorbic acid-rich foods. They mention ascorbic acid, that's just vitamin C, because if you are getting iron from plants, vitamin C will increase that absorption. It's not an issue if you're getting it from meat, you're just getting it. A diet high in foods that inhibit iron absorption, such as maize, beans, whole wheat flour, and sorghum. So those are risk factors for iron deficiency. In other words, not enough meat, too much grains and legumes. Here's another crucial mineral, zinc, which is significantly deficient worldwide. Its lack causes stunting, mental disturbances, delayed sexual maturity, among other things. And the the World Health Organization says you're at risk for zinc deficiency if your diet is high in unrefined, unfermented, and ungerminated cereal grains, especially when animal protein is negligible. High phytate soy protein products constitute the primary protein source. That's also a problem. So oddly, that's actually the diet that's being promoted here in wealthy countries. The same diet that's causing malnutrition in developing countries. I really don't know what these people are thinking. Some 250 million to 500 million children have so little access to vitamin A that they, first of all, go blind and in most cases just die. In particular, says the WHO, a diet of, I'm sorry, I lost some of that quote. What it's saying above that's cut off here is that a diet in animal-sourced food is the best way to get vitamin A. In particular, a diet including liver, eggs, and dairy products. It's not surprising then that the risk of vitamin A deficiency is strongly inversely related to intakes of vitamin A from animal-sourced foods. In fact, it is difficult for children to meet the requirements for vitamin A if their diet is low in animal-sourced foods, especially if their diet is also low in fat. Sometimes the World Health Organization gets something right. And then there are just multiple micronutrient deficiencies that affect each other. So every time you're deficient in one nutrient, the rest of your body can't work as well either, and there's this synergistic, unhappy synergistic effect where you're worse off the more deficiencies that you have. And the general thing that they say is, in particular, a diet that's low in animal source foods typically results in low intakes of bioavailable iron and zinc, calcium, retinol, vitamin B2, B6, and B12. In fact, if you include some dairy and organ meats, there isn't a deficiency in that entire document that wouldn't be addressed simply by eating ruminant animals. So that includes folate, vitamin D, vitamin C, other B vitamins, and iodine. So we have this situation where the combined effects of zinc, iron, and vitamin A deficiency, shown in this map, in many places is alarmingly high. Our population is rapidly expanding, so this problem isn't going away. And the best way to combat it, hands down, is like this. And we know this. Meanwhile, we've got a crisis on the other end of the spectrum happening in people who, while we get enough meat to prevent these deficiencies, are also eating a lot of green. We know what happens when from our diet you reduce meat and increase grains and beans and soy. That's the previous slide. And yet that's precisely what's being offered as a solution. I might suggest softly that instead we consider something like this, which is what we were treated to last night. You might recognize it. This is food for humans. This is the food we're adapted for. This is not the problem of our current health epidemic. Thank you.
So for those of you who don't recognize this, this is a fermented plant product. Thank you, Amber. And Amber did not mention, but I will, that she is organizing the world's first ever conference dedicated for carnivorous diets. And it's in March, it's in Boulder, yes, really Boulder. And if you want more information, please ask her. Our next speaker is Dr. Sara Place. Sara is Senior Director of Sustainable Beef Production Research at NCBA. Her role is to oversee the Beef Checkoff Funded Sustainability Program, including using life cycle assessment to benchmark the U.S. beef industry's sustainability. Prior to joining NCBA, she was an assistant professor of sustainable beef cattle systems at one of the other OSUs, the primary one, of course, being Oregon State University. You're welcome. In addition to her university experience, she served on the National Academies of Sciences Committee on Consideration for the Future of Animal Science Research that published the report Critical Role of Animal Science Research in Food Security and Sustainability. The title of her presentation is Beef in a Sustainable Food System. Please welcome Dr. Sara Place. And I won't... Where did we go? Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, thank you. And that's still not doing it. This is very, oh, I know what I could, no, I can't, can I? If I go Control Shift, does that? No. Where is the, oh, there it is. You drive.
Okay.
Thank you, Doctor.
I'm not a computer scientist, so we'll try to figure it out. Awesome. All right. So thank you very much for the introduction, and I'll just get right into it in terms of talking about beef in a sustainable food system. So when we talk about sustainability, that's definitely a word that has a lot of meanings to a lot of different people, right? I'm sure if we asked everybody what their most important criteria is for sustainability just within this room, we probably have as many priorities, right, as there are people in the room. But it's pretty well accepted that the fact that sustainability is not just about environmental issues, right? It's about the environment, social issues, including human nutrition, right, which is absolutely critical, and economics, right, especially for businesses. If you can't make money and be economically viable, you're not going to be sustainable, right? So there's many dimensions of sustainability. What's on the screen here is not an exhaustive list, right? It's just a short amount of what is important with sustainability. But I bring this up because oftentimes sustainability gets boiled down to environmental footprints, right? Things like carbon footprint. And it's important to recognize that there are so many different priorities, right? So there is no one single answer when it comes to sustainability. But sometimes in these policy discussions or in the media, people use what their definition is as the definition for sustainability, right? So it's important to recognize that there is no single answer when it comes to balancing all three of those areas. But animal agriculture obviously plays essential roles, and especially beef production and ruminant production like we just heard. That said, this is a lot of what I deal with in my job every day, right? Are some of the headlines that come out about beef or meat and sustainability. So in terms of kind of summing it up, we have I would say a prevailing narrative out there that meat production and beef production specifically is not sustainable. It's not healthy for people to eat it. So it's bad for human health. It's bad for planetary health, right? In terms of it produces so much greenhouse gas emissions, cattle have a high water footprint, et cetera, and animal welfare, right? We have a lot of animal rights concerns that are kind of infused in this whole topic. So it's kind of a perfect trifecta, if you will, of what's happening out there in terms of what the general public sees in the news media and from policy reports that can be quite influential, right? White papers that come out. So these are just some samples. I see some people kind of shaking their head, right? You're probably reading some of these headlines that are out there. So this one down here is my favorite. So this is Impossible Foods. How many of you guys have heard of Impossible? Or a few of you, right? The Impossible Burger, the burger that bleeds. It's made from plants, okay? So this guy, Pat Brown, is a former Stanford professor, and he decided he's going to make it his mission in life to what he has stated recently, essentially we want to eliminate animal agriculture by the year 2035, right? So speaking of deficiencies, right? He is a vegan as far as I know, so maybe he has some cognitive impairment, but that is what he says, right? I'm assuming in this audience, I get away from it with saying that. So what I've highlighted here, which I think is really interesting, is their argument is that using animals to make meat is a prehistoric and destructive technology, right? It's using all of our land, it's using all of our water resources. If we're going to survive in the future, if we're going to have a 9.8 billion population in 2050, we're going to somehow have to switch massively over to plants, right, in terms of our diet, because there's just no way possible that we can do it with animals. It's convenient that the solution is the product that he's selling, right? That's a pretty good deal. So what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides is essentially taking a lot of these, I can't cover them all, right, but some of these critiques that beef gets and kind of go through separating fact from fiction, if you will. So one is the feed conversion efficiency of beef cattle is usually used against them, right? It takes more pounds of beef. And greenhouse gas emissions, right? And then also land use, right? Those are the three I'm going to cover in the next few slides. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is, I hate using superpower, right, as a scientist, but something to hopefully connect with our non-agricultural audiences. What are cattle actually doing in our food system? We can argue that what they're doing is they're upcycling, okay? So what does that actually mean, right? We've all heard of recycling, taking something and making something of equivalent value. Upcycling is essentially taking something of little to no value and making a higher value product. And if we think about what cattle do, as we just heard from Amber, right, they're taking solar energy that's locked up in mostly human and edible plants, right, that's cellulose that we cannot break down, only bacteria can. And they're making a high quality product, both in terms of desirability, but also it has that protein, B vitamins, iron, zinc, right, all those nutrients that we actually need in the product itself. So what's really key here, and this is always surprising to the non-agricultural audiences I give these type of presentations to, is in the United States, whether we're talking about grass-finished or grain-finished beef, obviously both great choices, but if we think about just grain-finished beef, of course, most of what cattle eat in the United States is grass, is forage, right? And so that's often lost. People just have an image of a feedlot in their head, and they literally think cattle are born and die there, right? That's their entire life for beef production. But about 81% of what cattle eat in their life is forage. Of course, most of that is grazed forage. Another 10% is essentially our byproduct feeds, right? Our leftovers that we use from other industries. From all those grains that we process into human food, right? We have lots of byproducts that get produced that end up as animal feed. Or dried distillers grains, cottonseed, right? There's so many different examples. I think that's really important from a sustainability perspective for us to talk about, because we're essentially taking the waste of other industries and we're making something of value from it, right? I won't mention this again, but essentially a lot of those plant-based burgers, if you look at their ingredient list, they're generating a lot of byproducts as well, right? So they haven't come out and said, beef makes us more sustainable because they use our waste, but I think they should, right? That's essentially what's going on. So only about 9-10% of what grain-finished cattle eat in their lifetime is actually grain, right? So I put this up here because I think it's important to recognize, regardless of how cattle are finished, we are a forage-based industry, right, when it comes to beef production. That's true in the United States, it's true all over the world. And the reason that's important is because it really comes down to this whole idea of, well, cattle are just really inefficient in converting feed into product, and so we should eat less beef to be more sustainable, right? Use fewer resources. So that's a really interesting concept, but you can express feed efficiency many different ways, right? And I think it's important to think about that, and this is where this upcycling concept comes into play. So essentially what we have on the screen here is comparing grain-finished beef on average. This is a life cycle number, so this isn't just feed conversion efficiency, say in the feed yard, right? 13.8 pounds per pound of live weight gain versus broiler chickens versus pork. And so that's what's in the first column here, is dry matter conversion, right? So most people just stop right there and they say, well, look at this difference, right? If we're going to eat animal protein in the future, we need to switch to monogastric animals, right? Pigs and chickens, because they're a lot more efficient. However, what's masked is what I just showed you on the previous slide, right? It's mostly forage. It's mostly stuff that's not in competition with the human food supply from a resource use perspective, right? So when we actually take into account what cattle are eating that is potentially human edible, and maybe not human desirable, right? But if we have to eat corn and soy, we can, okay? And so how much of that is actually human edible? And you can see in the middle column there, right? Those differences across the species pretty well go away. Okay, it's roughly the same in terms of human edible feed required to make a pound of gain. So taking this one step further, this is kind of a weird concept if you haven't heard of it before, right? But some of the things that Amber just talked about, when we think about protein, we actually have the building blocks of protein, which are the essential amino acids. And there are, of course, significant differences between plants and animals in terms of the essential amino acids and how bioavailable they are when we eat them, okay? So this third column is taking into account what is the protein quality, meaning that amino acid quality, in the product itself versus what the animals actually consume. Okay, so in this case, a higher number is better because that means the quality is better coming out of the product. Okay, so what you can see is that cattle are above 1, right? So what this essentially means is we're generating more high-quality protein for the human food supply than the animals themselves are eating in the form of corn, right, or any other grain that they're consuming. So if we're going to talk about sustainability and a growing world population, right, it's hard to beat a system where you're making something, you're making more than you're using, right, from a sustainability perspective. So pigs and chickens don't look as good on here, right, and I'm just kind of using some book values, and maybe I made some assumptions that aren't favorable to them, but I don't work for them, right? I work for beef. So that's, that's the way that this looks. But just to add a further point on this, of course, as monogastric animals like us, they have to eat those essential amino acids. So you're going to find more soy, right, or other high-quality protein sources in their diets. And so that's why that ratio doesn't look as good in the third column for them. So this is one of those trade-offs when it comes to sustainability of that Venn diagram I showed you where those things overlap, right? Cattle, sheep, goats, these ruminant animals, they have this unique ability to upcycle, to make more protein than they're actually using. But they also naturally produce methane gas, okay? And so methane gas is a greenhouse gas. It's 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide at trapping heat in the atmosphere. And so there's been a lot of attention around that when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions and beef's contribution. So of course, I don't have to go through, digestive physiology or ruminants for you, but if the gas gets produced, you get a lot of carbon dioxide, the methanogens in there make methane gas about once a minute. Those cattle have to remove the gas, right? Otherwise they're going to get bloat. And this is one of the things that kind of drives me nuts in a lot of these news articles is people will still to this day refer to cow farts, right? Of course it's not that, it's cow burps, it's coming out the front end of the animal. And the other thing people often get wrong is this relationship between fiber and forages and concentrate feeds and how that actually affects methane emissions. So when cattle go to a feed yard and they're eating a grain-based diet, their methane emissions go down. Okay? When they're consuming more forage, they have higher methane emissions, and that's just the biochemistry of the rumen. More fermentable carbohydrates will mean less methane. So the second thing I'm going to talk to you about briefly here is just land use, and this is nothing, obviously, for this audience. You understand this quite well, right? That ruminants are expanding the land base that we have available for food production in America and around the world, right? The primary lands that we're using for ruminant agriculture cannot be cultivated. And oftentimes we're enhancing ecosystems when we have well-managed grazing systems. So this map, I like this map because it shows the different types, the land use types pretty well across the entire United States. Okay, so this is from the American Farmland Trust, who of course they're concerned about the loss of farmland, usually prime cropland, to development around all of our cities, which is a major issue in the United States. So that's kind of what the red splotches are all over the map, right? Our cities and around those urban cores where we're losing a lot of farmland to development. The kind of brownish color in the eastern United States, like where I'm from, that's where we have a lot of our forests, right? The dark green, the Corn Belt, Mississippi River Valley, Central Valley, California, that's our croplands. The lighter green is pasture land, and then the yellow, right? The darker yellow is all of our rangelands, and then our federal lands, right, that are kind of that lighter yellow color, right? So between both pasture and rangelands, that makes up about 40% of the land mass of the United States, right? That cannot be cultivated. But there's no way for us to take that solar energy that's hitting that ground and being captured by plants and actually generating food, generating wealth, right, without ruminant animals. And so that's really critical from a standpoint of land use. That said, what's usually used against cattle is the land footprint, right, which is one of the sustainability metrics that I like the least, okay? Land occupied per pound of product, right? Well, strawberries have a smaller footprint than beef, right? So therefore they're better. We get these kind of analyses to come out. But of course, land footprints don't tell you anything about the suitability of use, right? You're not going to grow strawberries, right, in a lot of these areas where we're grazing cattle. They don't tell you anything about multifunctional land use, right, both wildlife habitat and the actual grazing of cattle, or where we have integrated crop and livestock systems, right? That's really important. And they tell you nothing about the quality of use, right? Land footprints. Are we using land well, or are we degrading it, right? Degrading soils. So I would just argue that land footprints there's a lot of low informational value footprints out there, and that's probably the greatest one, right? And it really masks all the complexities of the land use question when it comes to sustainability. So I think this is important too. This black box that popped over Iowa is not just because I'm discriminating against Iowa, right? No disrespect if somebody's from there. But it's mostly, it's roughly the size of the land area of harvested corn grain that goes to beef cattle in the United States. Okay, so it's about 2% of cropland acres in the US. And if we're going to talk about land use and land use competition, right, cropland that's supporting cattle directly, right, that would be the only area that is. And as I just told you in a couple slides previous, we're making more protein for the human food supply by running that grain through cattle than if we were to eat the grain directly, right? So it seems like a pretty good trade-off, at least to me. So the last thing I'll talk to you about is how the U.S. compares to the rest of the world when it comes to sustainability and how things have changed over time. So if we were just going to zoom in on the carbon footprint as an example, this is a map that came out a few years ago in a publication that precedes the National Academies of Sciences, okay, looking at the carbon footprint or carbon intensity of beef around the world, okay. So where we have darker colors, like in the United States, Western Europe, that's where we have lower carbon footprints, okay. Places like South America, that's kind of showing up on this, is like this light green color. It's our intermediate carbon footprints. And places like Sub-Saharan Africa, the Indian subcontinent, that are purple, that's where we have the highest carbon footprints. Carbon footprints in those areas can be 10, 50, even 100 times greater than in the United States, okay? So that's a lot of variation in carbon footprints around the world, right? So what's actually going on here? A lot of it is explained by essentially the number of live animals it takes to produce beef with the end product. So by live animals, I don't just mean the animals that go to slaughter, but all the supporting herd, right? Number of cows, number of bulls, replacement heifers, etc. Okay? And so there are different factors that are kind of built into that, even just simply reproductive success, right? How many open cows do you have running around that go into this equation? So for example, in the United States, we are the largest beef producer in the world. Last year we produced around 26 billion pounds of beef, and we had a total cattle herd of all beef and dairy cattle of about 94 million head. If we were to go to Brazil, they're the number 2 beef producer in the world. They made about 21 billion pounds of beef, but they had a cattle herd of 220 million head. Okay, so they have twice as many cattle as us, but they make less beef. And again, what I just told you about cattle belching out methane every day, we need to feed them, right? All those resources that go into production, that's really where these differences in carbon footprints come into play. And this is not a negative against those other regions of the world, right? Lots of those places are practicing different types of systems, or people are holding on to livestock as a source of wealth, right? Not necessarily just to produce the end product in terms of food. The other thing is things aren't static, right? In terms of changes over time of environmental footprints or efficiency in general. So these 2 lines that are going on this graph here is essentially showing beef production in yellow and carcass weight from 1930 to today. And then in this teal color are the number of cattle, excluding our lactating dairy cows, okay? So you kind of see this divergence since the mid-70s, right, where we're producing more with less. And you can see the headline on the screen, right? It takes 36% fewer cattle to make the same amount of beef today. So that's huge from a sustainability perspective of doing more with fewer resources, fewer impacts. So that's a big change over time that's taken place. So I've mentioned greenhouse gas emissions a few times, and this is one of the things that we kind of get the biggest black eye with, or we see most of the media attention around when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. But it's important to put it in context, right? So these this GIF that's playing behind me right now, this is information from the US EPA's greenhouse gas emission inventory, okay? So this isn't a state secret, but most people don't realize that direct emissions that come from cattle only represent about 2% of our greenhouse gas emissions in America, okay? Transportation and electricity, about 26, 30% respectively. All of agriculture, including beef cattle, is about 9% of emissions, right? So it's a much smaller piece of the pie compared to all the other things that we have going on in our economy. I've also put in here landfills, right, which is important because the number one source of material that goes to landfills that makes methane gas is food waste, right? So from a whole food system sustainability perspective, we produce a lot of food that we then throw away, right? And even in the beef industry, we waste around 20% of edible beef. So we have essentially a 2-year investment from conception to getting a steak to somebody's plate, and then we have people throwing food away, right, and going to a landfill. So that's a really wasteful process from a sustainability perspective. If we can figure out ways to reduce food waste or do something with it besides just throw it away, that makes a big impact from a sustainability perspective. So Peter mentioned in my introduction, we do a lot of research with what we call life cycle assessments, essentially an environmental accounting system of looking at where greenhouse gas emissions occur along the supply chain. And so what you're looking at here is a summary of 4 years of work of looking at all across the United States and looking at the regional variation that exists in what we have predicted of greenhouse gas emissions that are occurring essentially cradle to farm gate. So all the things relating to food, feed production, electricity, et cetera, all the way to cattle leaving the farm operation, leaving a feedlot. So the range at the top, 17 to 27 kilograms of CO2e, that's an equivalency basis, and I'll touch on this on the next screen, what that means and maybe the limitations of that. This is the regional variation we saw across the United States. And this pie chart here just shows you where those emissions are coming from. Okay, so the biggest chunk in blue is the animal itself, is that methane that I mentioned. And again, that's why it gets so much attention, because that's our single biggest source. And that's really why there's a difference in carbon footprints between beef and, say, chicken. Chickens aren't ruminants, right? They only live 6 weeks. They have less opportunity to make greenhouse gas emissions, and that's why those biological differences exist. So the other colors there, manure is 7%, so that's mostly methane and nitrous oxide emissions. The yellow is feed production, so mostly nitrous oxide emissions that come from soils, right, if we apply fertilizer or nitrogen. The 4% anthropogenic CO2, that's essentially just meaning our on-farm use of four-wheelers, tractors, et cetera. The 13% resource production, that's all the upstream things like if we were to purchase fertilizer, what goes into making it, and the use of electricity on farm or on the feedlot. So this big chunk of methane, kind of going to go into the weeds a little bit, but I think this is important because, again, this is why we get criticized a lot in beef from a standpoint of emissions, okay? And so if you're not familiar with this, this is kind of a weird concept, but essentially we have different greenhouse gas emissions. You've all heard of carbon dioxide, there's methane, there's nitrous oxide. These gases have different potentials to trap heat in the atmosphere, but they also have different times they live in the atmosphere. So methane is a pollutant that actually only stays around for about 10 or 12 years, and then it gets broken down into CO2, and then it will be taken up by plants, right, and the cycle repeats, right, because essentially the methane, the carbon in the methane that the cattle are emitting is coming from photosynthesis, right, it's coming from the plants they eat. So the reason this is important is because there's some interesting research that's come out in the last year that would say maybe we're overestimating the actual effect that methane is having on warming, right? Especially these non-fossil sources of methane like cattle, right? Because ruminants didn't just start belching out methane in the last 20 years, right? They've been doing it for a while. So this is just a screenshot of a summary of one of those papers. Essentially, it's this whole idea of, is the pollutant itself long-lived, like carbon dioxide, which is what we would call a stock pollutant over there on the far right, versus flow pollutants, which are more like methane. They're going to have a half-life of, again, 12 years in the atmosphere. They're going to turn over. And so the whole concept here is that if we have steady emissions of methane, if our cattle population and sheep population remains roughly the same, or as I showed you, it's going down, then we're probably not increasing the concentration in the atmosphere, okay, if that makes sense. In the situation of when we burn fossil fuels in cars, right? And we emit carbon dioxide, and we emit a steady amount, the same amount every year. We are building up the concentration in the atmosphere because that carbon we're burning wasn't actually in the carbon cycle, right? It's been locked in the Earth's crust for a couple 100 million years. We're adding new carbon to the system. Well, it's kind of a confusing concept, but I think it is really important because, again, this paper that came out this summer would say that if we have, and there's lots of graphs going on here, but I just want to draw your attention to this in the center here, right? If we have constant emissions of CO2 and methane, our assumption of the warming effect for CO2 would be it keeps increasing the temperature. For methane, it's not going to have an effect on temperature, okay? So I think that's important because if our cattle herds are not increasing, right, as again they have not in the United States, it's really hard to point a finger to cattle, right, or sheep or goats as a source in the United States of climate change globally, right? Hopefully that makes sense. It's a lot of information in a short amount of time, but I just want to introduce that concept there. What I'll end with is this paper that I think is really super interesting. That kind of comes back to that narrative I showed you earlier, right? This whole idea that, you know, all of our world's problems can essentially be saved by just eating less meat, right? If you read some of these news articles, that's what people will put out there. If we just ate less meat, we would have fewer greenhouse gas emissions. We've kind of already debunked all the health claims, but those health claims are out there, right? So these two scientists last year essentially put this whole idea to the most extreme test, right? This whole less meat equals less heat idea. So what if in the United States we did eat less meat, right? Not just less, we ate no meat. We ate no animal products. Everybody in the United States becomes a vegan, and not just all the human Americans, every cat and dog in America, right, has now switched to a vegan diet, okay? So that's what was tested in this paper, okay? They modeled what that would look like, and they found, yes, indeed, we would reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2.6%. And I put in parentheses what that is globally, right? Less than 0.5% of global emissions. However, we would have a situation where we would have more calories, right? We probably don't have a calorie deficit in America or really in the world. We'd have more pounds of food, but we wouldn't have enough micronutrients to actually nourish everybody, right? So we'd be overfed and undernourished. So it would be non-viable from a whole population standpoint, okay? So that's what's going on here in this quote. These bar charts over here is just showing you the plus animals down at the bottom. That's our current scenario, and these are all the different sources of greenhouse gas emissions, okay? And that blue bar are the emissions that come directly from animals. And then the minus animals is this vegan scenario, right? So the only thing I want to draw your attention to is you don't get the full reduction of removing animals, right? You have to add back a replacement for all the manure you don't have anymore, right? You're going to have to add more synthetic fertilizer. You're probably going to have to till land that was pasture land, right? You're going to have to grow more legumes to try to meet our protein requirements and also to get, again, more nitrogen. So it's not a free lunch like this is somehow, like, or actually usually portrayed, that it's an easy swap. And then finally, the thing about this paper that's interesting is this only happens, of course, not just if we go vegan, but if you remove all the livestock. And by remove, I mean we'd have to have just a giant-ass barbecue, right? One-time barbecue. They would have to go away, right? They cannot go to an animal sanctuary, right, where we pet them 3 times a day, right? They have to go away. Because those cattle, again, they need to eat. They're going to emit methane. So if they exist, they're emitting methane. You also can't just replace them with bison, right? Because it turns out, oops, they're a ruminant too. So this is a lot more complicated than it's made out to be. These modeling scenarios usually just look at what's the carbon footprint of food A versus food B. Oh, if we just swapped, it would reduce that amount. That's not how things work, okay? But unfortunately, that's how this has been portrayed in the media and in a lot of serious academic journals too, which is unfortunate. So with that said, I'd like to come back to this idea of these impossible burgers or these other plant-based burgers, right? We don't need a plant-based burger, right? We already have one, okay? If we think about it. We already use a really amazing technology to make meat from plants, right? It's a technology that takes human and edible plants and makes a high-quality product, right? It's a solar bioreactor. That's pretty cool. It's mobile, right? It's able to harvest those plants without burning fossil fuels. That's awesome. It produces a high-quality organic fertilizer while it's doing it, and it self-replicates, right? So you guys know what I'm talking about, of course. It's cattle, right? Or any of our other ruminant animals. That is our original plant-based meat. So I think some of these things that we're dealing with in the media is how do we connect with people that aren't familiar, right? And some of these basic things, just talking about what you do, but with a little bit different lingo and talking about, hey, this is an amazing technology, right? It's not a prehistoric and outdated technology, okay? It's the end product of 3.5 billion years of evolution, and somebody didn't come up with a better solution in the last 5 years, right? That's not realistic. So that's really key from a sustainability standpoint. So with that said, thank you very much for your attention. If you guys are interested in any other information, this website that's on the screen houses all of our beef checkoff resources from a sustainability standpoint. You guys can check it out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both Dr. Place and Amber. Apologies for the technical difficulties. Unfortunately, I had to learn through your pain. So just a few to wrap, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Wow, that's really not what I'm seeing. It's not what I intended. The worst I ever experienced was where pictures moved from one slide to another within the file. Yeah, I have no idea how that even happened. Okay, wow. Really, I didn't mean to do anything. Please forgive me. It's nothing. Wow, blank. Okay, so I'm going to wing this, right? So we have heard the story, the projections about how in 32 years we're going to have 2 billion more human beings on the world, right? We've heard that in order to feed them, the FAO is suggesting we're going to have to double food production. That's going to be accompanied by a two-thirds increase in demand for animal protein. And, you know, we're not making any more land. In fact, it's arguable that we're losing cropland. So how are we going to do that? That's 32 years. Again, I've been arguing that we need to get people excited about something like a ruminant revolution. We need to mobilize support from public and private. We need to mobilize resources in the United States and worldwide. But there's some things in the way. These are policies, these are mindsets, these are belief systems. And we've got to find a way to better communicate what I say is the best story in agriculture, which is ruminant animal agriculture. But most of the consuming public obviously doesn't understand it because they're not involved in agriculture. Why should they? They've been hearing another side of the story. But everybody eats. Today in the United States, over half of adult Americans have either diabetes or prediabetes. What you need to understand about how bad that is that that's probably 10 years too late in diagnosis. We have better metrics. People don't know about it, they're not using it. Today in the United States, 60% of Americans have one or more chronic illnesses. It's chronic illness that's bankrupting this country, and it's a worldwide phenomenon. If you think that as was shown earlier with the diabetes map, okay, one of the highest rates of obesity in the world is South Africa. Now, I don't know about you, but the first time I heard that, that was just jarring to me. But what that forced me to do is look at my preconceptions. If you go to the nation of India, you will find one of the highest rates of diabetes despite the population not being overweight. Most of the narrative that we've been told about public health is wrong. And yet, what is our industry doing to educate itself, let alone the consuming public? And just recently there was a paper published that said that 88% of adult Americans are not metabolically healthy. And a significant number of the people who are weight normal are also not metabolically healthy. We've had people focusing on the wrong things. But again, everybody eats. So we need to overturn some of the policy. We need to find ways to reach out to different audiences, right? There's too few of us in agriculture. The quote that I heard at a conference was, the average American today is more likely to have direct personal experience with the criminal justice system than with production agriculture. Now, there's a whole lot wrong with that. There's a whole lot wrong with that, but that was a quote that I had to write down to make sure I got it right, and then I had to go check it out. And the best I could find is Department of Justice statistics and USDA Census of Ag statistics, both from 2012. And when you look at that, the USDA lists 2.1 million Americans as primary operators of farms. At the same time, we had 2.2 million Americans locked up. Local, state, federal, not parole, not probation, incarcerated. And I gave that statistic at one ranching thing, and the man came up to me, as you always do, which is what's great about ranching and farming audiences, and they said, yeah, Pete, what does it take to be considered a primary operator of a farm? What's a farm by USDA definition? Oh, you just have to sell $1,000 worth of goods off your property. Well, that's a good hobby, and I'm all for it. Don't misunderstand me. But if you drill into that 2.1 million number, over 70% made less than 25% of their, over 75% of that number made less than 25% of their household income from their farm. So that's the gap between production agriculture and the consuming public. And if we desperately need to talk with ourselves to make sure that this message gets out, all right? Because I don't think the farming population is that different than the rest of the population in terms of the burden of chronic illness, okay? But in terms of enlisting people who would be interested in promoting what you do in your land stewardship and your animal welfare practices, and what you're doing to protect and enhance while producing an essential food resource. We have to find a way to reach people who aren't familiar with what you're doing, and all they're hearing is the other side. And prepare yourselves, because there's a whole nother load of organic fertilizer heading your way. This January, I'll just warn you right now that there's something in the works, and it's coming. And it'll be about how meat is bad for you and it's bad for the planet, and what's the right level of taxation to put on your product to limit its intake. So we desperately need to do this. I'm convinced. If you're interested in learning more about diet, health, human nutrition, and you have not read books by Gary Taubes, T-A-U-B-E-S, then start with The Case Against Sugar. It's his latest one. If you'd like to know how it was we came to believe that saturated fat is a health hazard, then I would recommend reading Nina Teicholz's book, T-E-I-C-H-O-L-Z. And her book is called The Big Fat Surprise: Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet. I'm happy to answer questions through email and contact. You can find me all over social media. I deeply apologize for the problems with technology. I only act like I know how to use it. And today I didn't act too well. So now at this point, we'll transition into a question, answer, and comment section. I guess we've got about 15 minutes. Is that right? We're supposed to be done at 4:30? Okay. That took a little longer than I intended. I'm sorry. That's my fault. Could we have a round of applause again for Amber and Dr. Place? So, are there any questions or comments, please, for Amber or Dr. Place? Okay, so boiling down the question, I think I need to repeat it so it ends up on the recording. The food pyramid and with grain or grain products at the base was a product of, what was it, the 80s, and it actually has been replaced twice. Now, of course, we have the food plate, where your product is meant to be a condiment, not a main product. And if you're going to eat it at all, and only twice a week, I think, is where we're down to. So they're going through an evolution of that. I'll just tell you that we've had nominations for service on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. So now a committee will be formed. They'll do their work. They'll come out with the 9th edition, which will be the 2020 version. But understand that the last time they were fully prepared to say that even lean meat no longer belonged in a healthy diet pattern. And they were going to justify that based on sustainability grounds. So be aware, watch them. Any other comments? Oh. No, never mind.
I would add that I think there's a lot of pressure not to lose face for those organizations. And I think if they're going to come around, it's going to be slowly, a bit at a time, in such a way that they can say, we've been saying this all along, but you didn't necessarily understand us right the first time. But I am a bit cynical about that.
Sir.
Yeah, I guess along these lines, it's going to sound, I apologize for this question. I don't mean for it to be obnoxious, but it sound a little bit that way. I found both the presentations fascinating, and yours is a very compelling argument. My question to you personally is, how does a self-professed data scientist and computer scientist stand their ground against this large population of nutritionists and other scientists who work in this field, and well, stand your ground against that, the very people who made the food pyramid and its sequel?
Actually, as a data scientist, it's a lot clearer to see what the problems are, because most of the nutritional science that is brought to the public today is based on a kind of science called epidemiology, which is data science. What you're doing is you're taking a huge database of collected data on what people eat and trying to make statistical correlations between that and diseases. And so that is exactly the kind of thing that I did in my last job. I would take data and find these different outcomes that their clients would want to know about and to change, and try to, well, the problem is that my clients would want to know how to cause the outcome that they want, and all I can offer as a data scientist is a prediction. But I know full well as a data scientist that just because a set of data can predict an outcome doesn't mean that if you change it in a particular way, it will change the outcome in the way you're expecting.
I'm not debating your ability to do that.
Okay, so
What I'm asking is how do you walk into a room full of people who have had their life profession resting on this, and stand your ground and make this credible case?
science progresses one death at a time. I'm not sure that those people who are invested in those ideas and whose careers critically are invested can necessarily be persuaded. I have seen some very courageous people who have changed their minds. I might mention Tim Noakes, who made a great name for himself. He's a physiology professor who wrote about running, and he wrote about the importance of a carbohydrate-based diet. When he found that to be untrue, he publicly changed his mind and has gotten a lot of flack for it, but that kind of person does exist also.
It's a sort of a sociological question almost.
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
My question is to Amber.
I understand. I'm going to step in here, and with due respect, there's so many narratives in there that need to be deconstructed. Number one, I don't think corn is the universal grain used in finishing rations across the United States. Understood. Omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is a whole nother question that we can talk about. A lot of that came from the idea that fat in the diet causes heart disease, and that's not true. Saturated fat from animal products does not cause heart disease. And it just, we were told it did because people were convinced by bad epidemiological data and their personal belief systems. And then what we have is situations where we'll find a population that eats a lot of fat, doesn't have heart disease. What could it possibly be? It can't be that our original hypothesis was wrong, right? It can't be that fat maybe doesn't cause heart disease. It must be, and then we find olive oil, antioxidants, fish oil, some explanation to explain how we can hold on to that original hypothesis. And so I would, again, respectfully, want to have a fuller conversation around that because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. But I understand where you're coming from with that because that's a very common understanding, if that makes sense.
The arachidonic acid is a promoter of inflammation, and inflammation is a high promoter.
Arachidonic acid is something that is used in the body for inflammation, but the cause of the inflammation is disease and other problems that can be caused by diet. So if you're blaming arachidonic acid, it's like blaming the firefighters for a fire.
I know the carbohydrate, a high amount of carbohydrate in the diet is a part of the inflammatory.
Right, so arachidonic acid provides the biochemical basis for creating inflammation. Inflammation can be made out of arachidonic acid, but the reason that it's made is the thing that we need to address, not the fact that it's made, not the thing that it's made of.
The fact that it keeps going on.
Yes, yes. Arachidonic acid by itself doesn't cause inflammation.
But what I'm saying is they're promoted together. The excess carbs that we're ingesting, plus the fact that the arachidonic acid helps to promote the inflammation to bring down.
It doesn't promote inflammation. Well, yes, it's there to, it can be used to make inflammation, which is a good thing if you have a problem, because inflammation is a way of that your body fights an issue.
Prolonging of it that creates the chronic diseases, especially the heart disease and all of those fibromyalgias and all of the inflammatory types of diseases. So, but I'm just saying that's my concern is that when you explain to people, I agree, meat is great. You did great. I appreciate that. You opened my eyes, and I say meat is great. However, I'm concerned that once you determine that we're getting all of our nutrients from the meat, then it's kind of like a mono thing. Anytime you have a mono situation for human beings, it's going to lead to other problems because we are designed to be in a balance.
I want to stop you for a second. That balance narrative is something that grows out of, remember that slide I had where you have all these different sources of food and you have to mix and match them to try to get what you need? That's where the idea of balance comes from, and the more plants that you have in your diet, the more tricky a game that is. So the more plant-based your diet is, the more you have to work to balance it. As soon as you put the right food in the picture, that whole idea of trying to balance just falls out of the way, because that food covers, it is balanced already, naturally. It covers everything that we need. It's only if you're relying on, ironically, I grew up in a vegetarian household, and I learned about complementary proteins. I was taught that I can't eat get all of my protein from peanut butter because it's not a complete protein. I have to balance my diet by adding this kind of legume, this kind of legume, and this kind of legume. Balancing is a game that comes into play when you're not eating the right foods in the first place.
Thank you. And we'll be around. I don't think either one of us is going anywhere for a while, so thank you. Sir.
Given the fact that due to conferences like this, enhanced and regenerative grazing practices, I think are only going to increase as we move into the future. And those kinds of practices can dramatically increase the amount of carbon stored in the soil. Do any of these carbon footprints give credit to that?
No, pretty much. Most of them do not. So all those life cycle assessments usually assume the amount of carbon that gets sequestered by plants is equal to the amount that cattle respire, right? So that is a huge area, obviously, of another one of those positives of telling that story of well-managed grazing systems, and not just carbon, right, but all the other benefits that come along with it from an ecosystem standpoint. So yeah, that's one of the many shortcomings, is that's usually just ignored in these analyses.
And while we're looking at the carbon cycle, I would urge us to spend more time looking at the water cycle, because we know that. And then there's little things that I can't help myself. I just have to point out that while the beef cattle industry is 2% of U.S. anthropogenic global, greenhouse gas emissions, I never get that one right, the U.S. healthcare industry is 10%. Right? So it's arguable that we could double beef consumption, which, if it was doubling the size of the industry and the emissions, if that had a halving of the healthcare impact, we'd be better off, right? So it's just, we're not good at looking at the positives and the negatives, and everything that we do is going to have an impact. But I don't think we've come to the point where we can make, that hasn't entered in. So, but it will, I think. Yes, ma'am. And then.
I think that one of the reasons that people these days tend to need 3 meals is not just 3 meals a day. My children at their school, they feed children every couple of hours, and the reason is because their blood sugars are up and down constantly, because they're eating so much carbohydrate that it causes their blood sugar to rise. The insulin comes in to lower the blood sugar, it goes down, and they're hungry again. If you stop eating carbohydrates to that degree, your blood sugar levels become steady. The food that you ate, some of it you will use right away, some of it you will put on your fat stores, and then instead of it being a one-way system, your fat will then be used for the rest of the day to feed you. I've been eating I actually don't eat any plants whatsoever. I've been eating a completely meat-based diet for 9 years, and many times I've eaten just 1 meal a day, but typically it's 2. So definitely from personal experience alone, I would argue that no, we don't need to eat that often if we're eating the right foods.
So if you didn't hear the question, it was about USDA organic and why were ionophores left off the list. I don't know in terms of how that process worked and what was put on and what wasn't. Obviously, organic, it is administered under AMS, right? It's a marketing program, so it has these strict guidelines. The box was drawn somewhere, and those were left off. For sure, we know a lot of the technologies that are outside of that box can help us be more efficient, including ionophores, right? Even though they're not human medically important antimicrobials, And there are a lot of things when it comes to some of these certifications that can be a little bit arbitrary, right? If you really scrutinize the criteria, it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? But that again comes back to that complexity of what people want and providing choices. Of course, I don't think you can just say organic equals sustainable, right, and conventional equals unsustainable, for sure. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. That effect of feeding rumensin or ionophores to depress methane and improve feed efficiency is very clear, and it's been there for 40 years, right? So
I'm afraid it's 4:30 by this device. I don't know that we have anything coming after us in here, so we can certainly stay and continue to ask questions, but I think just thank you for coming, and can we another round of applause. You had a question?
My question's about methane digesters in the dairy industry and whether or not that would improve overall cattle methane sustainability for the U.S.
So yeah, that's been something that has been out there for many years, right? So,
but it's not economically.
Do we want to keep using this for?
Yeah. So the question was about methane digesters for the dairy industry, right? So yes, if they work and you can reduce methane emissions, methane digesters, you're taking that manure and you actually are encouraging the production of methane, right? Production of biogas. Typically that's used to, combust it on the farm and actually power a generator, right? There's lots of other ideas of trying to clean it up, run trucks. There's some people that are doing that. It takes a lot of scrubbing of the biogas. So yeah, when it works, it's great. It's a huge capital investment, and there are lots of things that can go wrong because it's a complex microbial system, right? Just like cattle's rumen, but a little bit different. So that is one of the challenges in places like California, where there's this new environmental regulation for the greenhouse gas emissions. That's one of their key things they're putting out there, is that we should use more digesters as a way to reduce emissions from liquid dairy manure, right? So manure methane emissions are higher from the dairy industry than the beef industry, because obviously most of the beef industry is handled either out in the field extensively, it's not managed, right? Very little methane, or even when it's in a feed yard and it's in that solid form, it doesn't emit much methane. So it is more of a dairy focused thing. So it's just one of those, who's going to pay for it, right? If it costs $1 million, $2 million, and the farmer doesn't have the capital to do it, is the state going to step in? That's the question there.
Well, that's my argument. If we come into this food tax, if somehow they pass that, shouldn't it be going to the heat and food for emissions, like greenhouse gas wise, instead of.
Or maybe it should go on transport and all the, they won't do that, will they? I will mention I saw a really great piece of technology around organic matter gasification. It was in Southern California, where they were setting up a system that would basically take all organic matter, which would include plastic, could include animals, but and converted that then through a process that produced potable water, biochar, a catalyst that had to be recharged, but it removed the sulfur, methane, which was then converted to zero sulfur diesel and paraffin. And that's what came out of that process. Now, that was a few years ago. It was a pilot plant. The last time I checked the website, it didn't look like a lot of activity had happened recently, but there's some other technologies in that space that are kind of interesting.
Yeah.
What's the question?
Can you share your presentation?
Yes.
Is there political influence behind pyramid plate research? Is it from mega companies based, putting out the money, dealing with
So,
results?
So, I mean, in this space, you know, kind of what I had showed in that first slide, right? A lot of this, it's not just evidence-driven, it is values-driven, right? And so part of that is interest in terms of financial interest, for sure, and political from that perspective. But just previously held beliefs, right? Like we've heard a couple other times, when people have strongly held beliefs, right, they're not going to necessarily give them up. We're all guilty of that, right? If you have your belief, you're going to change your mind quickly, right? So a lot of that is what drives it. There are vested interests or large companies that are companies that make a lot of processed food that are very interested in sustainability and have lots of initiatives out there that maybe aren't foods that are the most helpful, right? But they have the pockets to do it. And so even though we kind of get labeled like big ag and big meat, right, we don't actually have that much in the way of organization money put towards it, if it makes any sense. I mean, I'm the only person the Beef Checkoff has working on sustainability, right? So I am big ag, right? I am big meat. So that's it, you know, it's a one-woman show.
So in the middle of that, what's the best avenue for us to take? I remember as a health teacher showing Morgan Lindner's Super Size Me and how he showed big money versus us. So how can we get our dollars to be the most helpful?
That's a great question, and I'd like to have some suggestions because I very much want to see what we can do, but where I'm convinced at this point is it's got to be, you know, grassroots, you should pardon the expression, from the bottom up, that we have to get more people aware and get our industries aligned with where the science and the clinical practice is, not where the policy is, and then drive that through whatever networks we have. There are, of course, major interests, and I don't want to get too conspiratorial, but you can just make a good list, but let's be sure that we include the, you know, the exercise industry, for example, or the diet industry, right? What's better than a diet that doesn't work if you can keep getting people to come back for it? You know, that's a great business model. I'm convinced that the marketplace will respond when the market changes. Nobody wanted fat-free yogurt until we were told that we should be eating fat-free yogurt. And I'm sure that the marketplace has enough or the, you know, industry has enough of a sense of what's going on in the marketplace to adapt to changes in trends. And so I think that what we certainly can do is educate ourselves, have an impact in our families and in our communities, and then wherever we're called beyond that to have effect.
I just wanted to add this idea of who benefits can be really powerful, even if it's not really conspiratorial. So if, say, the pharmaceutical industry benefits from you not getting well outside of pharmaceuticals, then they're not probably the people you want funding your studies. But on the other hand, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Insurance companies are companies that benefit from from real statistical truths. So I think if any industry is going to catch on to what actually has an effect on human health, that might be one of the industries that does. Because if they've got the models wrong, then they lose money. And they're one of the few industries I can think of that that's true for.
So Diane Rogers is behind that Sustainable Dish podcast, and she is part of a team that's trying to put together that documentary. So there are other efforts to make mass media communication, but that's a good point, right? Because we have a lot of crapola on Netflix that a lot of people watch, right? Whether it's Cowspiracy or anything else. So.
There are more in the works, and I'm not remembering all the names, but one thing that food lies, yes, there was recently the magic pill. One thing that came to mind when you were saying that was that what I think actually convinces an individual, so there's exposure to the information in the first place. I can't get the idea of that a grain-based diet might not be the healthiest necessarily. I'm not going to come to that on my own unless I hear of it. But once I hear of it, I think the most important thing is when someone is motivated enough to try for themselves, because the results are so obvious once you try different dietary strategies that they really do have effects. And so if we can come up with simple steps that people can take and encourage actually self-experimentation rather than relying on authorities, rather than saying, well, this person says this and this person says that, now who do I believe? Instead, try to teach people how they can verify what the truth is.